Good morning, everyone. There will be a few more people that have registered and are joining. I'd like to welcome you to the first EPRC webinar of the autumn series. My name is Carlos Mendez. I'm a director at the European Policies Research Centre at the University of Strathclyde. We're delighted to welcome you to this webinar today and hopefully to future webinars. Today's speaker is Fabian Gal from the University of Rennes, who will present on the topic of simplification in EU cohesion policy. The presentation will be around 30 minutes, and then we can have a question and answer and discussion session. If you'd like to speak, just raise your hand or use the chat function then. To let you know, the meeting is being recorded, which means it can be revisited at a later stage. We'll post this on our YouTube channel, which will be shared by email with you. Feel free to use social media to share thoughts on the webinar. Let me present our speaker today. Fabian Gal specializes in European regional policy and EU cohesion policy in particular. He studied at the universities of Aberdeen and the University of Luxembourg on European studies and European governance. He then worked as an administrator at the European Committee of the Regions, at the COTA Commission, the Commission for Territorial Cohesion Policy and the EU budget. He then joined us at the EPRC for a couple of years, working on a number of projects for the European Commission, European Parliament, ESPON, as well as our policy networks, IQNet and EORPA. Since 2019, he's been based in Lyon, doing research and also teaching some political science and public policy at the University of Lyon, before being employed as a researcher at the French region, pursuing this PhD topic on simplifying access to EU structural funds at the University of Rennes. Okay, so I'll give the floor to you, Fabian. Thank you.
Thanks, Carlos, for this introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to present my research. Let me just see if I can share my screen. Okay, no, that doesn't. Can you see my screen yet?
We can see the screen, but not the full presenter mode. Yes.
Yeah. Let me just.
Yes, that's fine.
Now you should have the full presenter mode. Okay, well, thanks. And as Carlos mentioned, so this is part of my PhD project, which I'm doing at the University of Rennes. But as you mentioned, I'm also I'm employed by the managing authority of the Auvergne Rhône-Alpes region. So this is 2 ERDF, ESF programs in 2014-20 and one in the 21-27 period, because the two regions have merged. So we are now the big La Région Auvergne Rhône-Alpes region. So just to mention, this is part of my PhD project, so the views I expressed are mine, and do not necessarily represent those of my employer, the Auvergne Rhône-Alpes regions. Just to underline the collaborative approach of this PhD project. So I'm employed by the Auvergne Rhône-Alpes regions, having access and looking at the implementation from an inside perspective. And in that regard, I work very closely with the director, deputy director of the direction of the European funds, Luc Bott, and I've got two brilliant thesis supervisors, Romain Pasquier and Sébastien Bourdin, who I would like to mention just before going into depth of my presentation. Now, this being an EPRC webinar, I thought it would be appropriate to make reference to an IQNet paper, which by now dates already a couple of years, but which was then titled, "Is Simplification Simply a Fiction?" And I think this is quite illustrative of the topic of my research and really the debates on cohesion policy, because indeed, like cohesion policy has been criticized for being very complex and difficult to implement for quite a number of years. And if you're familiar with the implementation of cohesion policy, you've certainly come across the many efforts to try to simplify the implementations, things like simplified cost options, administrative capacity building, single audit principle. There was even a high-level group for simplification. And all these efforts have been going on for quite a long time and led our former colleague Sarah Davis at EPRC back then asked, is it simply a fiction? Because the results were not quite obvious back then. And I argue that despite all these simplification efforts, today has cohesion policy become much more simple to implement than previously. And I think there is quite some evidence that while there might be improvements in certain areas, I think simplified cost options have certainly had an impact, but that has not changed fundamentally the perception of cohesion policy being very complicated to implement. So this is really the main question of my PhD that I wanted to dig deeper into and to understand why is implementation of cohesion policy so complicated. Now, if you look at the literature, there is, of course, a multi-level governance, which means that several actors at different levels of governance need to interact and coordinate their actions in order to implement cohesion policy. And there is also the place-based approach, which entails essentially that there is some flexibility within the design of the policy in order to adapt to local and regional territorial specificities to really adapt the policy to local context. So there are arguments to say there is some inherent complexity of cohesion policy implementation. But if you look at the literature, and here I'm referring to Carlos and John's work, among others, who argue that the inherent complexity can be remedied with good administrative capacity. So that's the main argument, that while it is complex, if you have good administrative capacity, you should be able to reduce that complexity and have better implementation results as a consequence. However, I wonder whether it is enough to explain the perception of complexity. Is good administrative capacity enough to fully explain the perception of complexity? I asked this question because administrative capacity is a bit of a vague concept because of so many different implementation contexts that administrative capacity or cohesion policy implementation is facing. There's so many different variables, and administrative capacity building does certainly not look the same in one region compared to another. And also implementation of cohesion policy might even run into difficulties in situations where there's high administrative capacity building. So if you look at, for example, my region where I currently live and work, the Auvergne Rhône-Alpes region, we have simplification as a high political and administrative priority. There's lots of initiatives trying to simplify the implementation of cohesion policy implementation. And if you look at the quality of government index of DG Regio, we're not doing too bad. We are clearly above average. Yet, if you look at the absorption rates, there are certainly some difficulties that we are facing even in this high administrative capacity context, and despite simplification being a high political and administrative priority. So just the blue line is the EU average, and at the end of 2023, Auvergne Rhône-Alpes region was the dark green line, and we were clearly above the average. And another interesting fact to point out is that the two different programs in Auvergne Rhône-Alpes were quite different in terms of their absorption rate at the end of 2023. So I wanted to understand this situation and complement the administrative capacity building literature in order to understand the root causes of administrative capacity complexity. Sorry. So in order to understand the root causes of complexity, I try to develop a theoretical model on complexity during implementation. And obviously, a first step in doing that would be to define a complexity. Traditionally, complexity was linked to the rules, the implementation rules, and the effort that is required to comply with the rules. However, complexity also is a kind of a vague concept, and which goes beyond just the mere effort required to comply with the implementation requirements. Indeed, complexity is quite subjective. Something that is complicated to me might be really easy to you, and there's no obvious measure in how to define at what rate of effort, for example, an implementation rule becomes complex. So my definition really tries to get around this narrow link between the rules and the complexity and focus more on the subjective side of complexity and the perception. The perception of beneficiaries. Essentially, I'm focusing on beneficiaries because ultimately this is what counts for implementation of cohesion policy. So I define the complexity as the perception of utility on the one hand and the capacity to respond. So really the question we need to ask is, what is influencing the perception of complexity? And here I introduce another concept, and this is really the main argument of my thesis, which is still developing, and that is around policy ambiguity. So I argue that policy ambiguity is the root cause of administrative complexity. Ambiguity, I define it as the possibility to interpret and respond differently to the same situation. So there are several dimensions to it. Could be the availability of information or the lack thereof, incoherences in implementation, or conflicts in interactions between actors, which all contribute to ambiguity. So how does policy ambiguity lead to perception of complexity? And this is essentially my theoretical model starting at the level of policy. If you look at what policy is, I argue that there is certainly some inherent ambiguity in all policies. This is due to the fact that policy making involves numerous actors who interact with each other, all have their different ideas, interests, who all interact when it comes to policy making. So in order to find compromises and formulate something that is acceptable to several parties, there needs to be some ambiguity or flexibility in designing the policy. Another point why policies are inherently ambiguous is due to the fact that you cannot anticipate all implementation situations. So even with the best of knowledge and intention, you cannot design a policy which responds to all situations that may arise during implementation. However, the ambiguity of a policy is obviously variable. There's variety in the ambiguity. Not the same actors are present in all policies. They have not the same interests, and the level of conflict between them is not the same. So I expect that there is variability in the ambiguity of policies. Then there is the implementation stage. At implementation stage, traditionally implementation was seen as something automatic, just the application of the political will expressed by the public policy. However, we do know, and I fully subscribe to that, that during implementations, there are humans involved, there are institutions involved, so there's something happening at implementation which might alter the initial design of the policy. In terms of ambiguity, there are two situations that can happen. Either the ambiguity of the policy is reduced, or it's being transposed all the way to the beneficiaries. And looking at the literature, policy literatures, I have developed one argument, which is that effective strategic management is a condition to reducing ambiguity at the implementation stage. Now, the different variables is there are lots of variables which can potentially influence implementation, but trying to organize this literature and identify that argument which can reduce ambiguity, I have identified effective strategic management because it allows making sense of all the other variables and combine them into a coherent implementation strategy, which should then result in a reduction of ambiguity for the recipients. However, that's obviously not always the case. So there are many situations in which ambiguity is being transposed all the way to the beneficiary level. So I've also looked at what impact ambiguity can have on the beneficiary on the reception side of a public policy. So if it is not clear what the policy is all about, what the objectives are, and how to implement a policy, then that obviously leads to situations where a beneficiary might not even be sure whether a potential beneficiary can be beneficiary. So those beneficiaries might not interact, potential beneficiaries might not interact with a policy at all. However, there should be situations where beneficiaries interact after all, and I hypothesize that this is due to the reinforced importance of networks, which may then push a beneficiary to interact with the policy after all. So one consequence of ambiguity should be the reinforcement of networks. Another consequence should be the reduction of the perception of utility. If you don't really know what the policy is trying to achieve, you are less likely to understand what this whole the whole policy is about, and you are likely to consider the implementation requirements and the demands upon you as less favorable. And that, according to the literature, leads to a heightened perception of complexity, administrative complexity. Another consequence is reduced capacity, because if you do not know what the requirements are, you are less likely to be able to fulfill the requirements quite simply, and that again leads to heightened perception of complexity. So this really is my theoretical model of the links between policy ambiguity and the consequences of perception of complexity. So as a next step, I have applied this model to cohesion policy, to evaluate the literature on cohesion policy, to see whether I find evidence for these individual theoretical hypotheses that I have developed earlier. Now, if you look at the policy level of cohesion policy, I argue that there is intentional ambiguity. Probably the term used is flexibility. I've alluded to it earlier. There's the place-based approach, which allows for a clarification of or of policy requirements and implementation during the implementation phase. So in order to be able to adapt to specific contexts and given situations, it is by design foreseen to be able to adapt the policy during implementation by what is the place-based approach. There is also high variability in cohesion policy, because cohesion policy being a regional development policy, the themes that cohesion policy is addressing are quite large. And as I've alluded to earlier, the different actors present, stakeholders present within these thematic areas are varying. So are the different requirements, the rules to be respected, national rules, local rules that need to be respected. That means that according to the literature, I argue that there's quite some variability in ambiguity of cohesion policy. At the implementation phase, I argue that the ambiguity is indeed being transposed all the way to the beneficiaries. And that is because systemic obstacles hinder the emergence of effective strategic management. Those systemic obstacles are, on the one hand, strict requirements which reduce the possibility of flexibility, the possibility to fully apply the place-based approach during implementation. I'm thinking notably at the decommitment rules, but also things like thematic concentrations, which are really limiting the flexibility. On the other hand, there might be too much flexibility in other areas, for example, the interpretation of rules. And here is really the literature has pointed out the importance of audits and the difficulties that cohesion policy is facing with audits, which on the one hand is leading to a heightened focus on financial implementation as opposed to the strategic planning, long-term planning, in terms of achieving other results and other objectives. And those two factors, on the one hand, too much flexibility, and the other hand, too little flexibility, is really can be identified as systemic obstacles which hinder the emergence of effective strategic management. On the reception side, there is surprisingly little analysis of the perception of beneficiaries of cohesion policy. However, there is some indications that indeed networks are important, and that indeed the objectives of cohesion policy might not be very clear at the beneficiary level. And also there is some evidence to indicate that the capacity is reduced at the beneficiary level. So applying my theoretical model to cohesion policy seems to confirm the link between policy ambiguity and complexity. So just to sum up, and just in one slide, these are my hypotheses, which I've deducted from applying my theoretical model to cohesion policy. So on the one hand, the variety of ambiguity, on the other hand, ambiguity which is being transposed, the increased importance of networks, the reduction of the perception of the utility or usefulness, and a reduction of beneficiaries' capacity. So I went on to try to test these hypotheses in my case study, which is the Auvergne Rhône-Alpes region, using mixed methods methodology. On the one hand, I did interviews with my fellow colleagues and stakeholders, and also some beneficiaries, to really try to get a whole picture of implementation. That includes also a European level, national and regional levels. Participant observation, I took advantage of my position here within the managing authority to participate in meetings, share an office with colleagues, discuss their difficulties that they are facing in everyday implementation of cohesion policy. And I did an online survey where I've sent a questionnaire to all beneficiaries in the Auvergne Rhône-Alpes regions since 2014. So quite a comprehensive, and I've got more than 370 responses to that survey from beneficiaries in all thematic areas since 2014, quite an even spread. So what did I find? First of all, policy ambiguity seems to affect all areas of cohesion policy implementation. It was quite obvious to me that there is lots of areas which are not sufficiently clear for a beneficiary, and at the managing authority level, what they're trying to do is offer almost a case-by-case support to beneficiaries in order to clarify and try to make sense of implementation. And on the other hand, there is securitization, where the managing authority can never be sure that despite their best efforts to apply the rules correctly, another actor within the implementation process, most likely the auditors, will have a different interpretation of the same rule and thus apply financial correction to the operation in question, or to a project. So the managing authority really is trying to respond to that insecurity, that ambiguity, to offer almost a case-by-case support to beneficiaries, and also securitization, which means maybe go beyond what is strictly required by the regulations to ask for additional justification, additional proof in order to attempt to prevent a different interpretation by another authority later on. In terms of variability, I've identified 3 groups which seem to be most affected by the ambiguities in the Auvergne Rhône-Alpes region. The first group concerns those beneficiaries which happen to have a project in a thematic area which overlaps with regional policies or national policies to some extent as well. Cohesion policy obviously does not operate in a vacuum. There are regional policies as well, and the implementation of regional policies sometimes works in parallel to cohesion policy implementation. And in those situations, for a beneficiary, it is quite ambiguous when, under what conditions, cohesion policy is funding, should be funding the project, under which conditions a regional or national program should be funding that same project. And also the requirements in terms of implementation are quite different. The justification needs, the requirements to produce documents are not the same in the 2 situations. The second group concerns projects where there are many stakeholders involved, either because that's within the planning already, there's many stakeholders involved, or because there's just a bigger projects where many different co-financing partners are involved in financing the same project, and they do not have the same requirements on the beneficiaries, which leads to situations with heightened ambiguity. And there's also some the quality of beneficiaries also matters in terms of the ambiguity. Small, new beneficiaries seem to struggle more in understanding what the policy is about and how to implement it than bigger beneficiaries or those who have been beneficiaries for a number of years already. And in particular, associations also stand out because they tend to be smaller and tend to have less experience with implementing cohesion policy funded projects. In terms of just the transposition of policy ambiguities, so I can confirm the theoretical hypothesis which I've deducted. Automatic decommitment, the N+3 rule, really seemed to push the management of the implementation towards financial compliance and to prioritize the spending. And that leaves some flexibility, and there's some intentional flexibility left in the management of the implementation in order to be able to meet this target. Distribution of implementation responsibilities is also something that I could confirm, notably the case with auditors, the difficulties which can arise from different interpretation of the same rules. And there might be conflicts between the strategic planning and changing European and regional political priorities. I think it's been pointed out before that cohesion policy as a crisis instrument has been used quite extensively in the past, and that I could observe also as leading to additional ambiguity and leading to a situation where the ambiguity is transposed all the way to the beneficiaries. Looking at the reception of policy ambiguity, the importance of networks seems to be confirmed as well. A large number of the beneficiaries in Auvergne Rhône-Alpes have gained knowledge of funding possibilities either through other services of the Auvergne Rhône-Alpes Region administration, some direct contact with the managing authority, or some other way through their professional networks. So there's quite a lot of intermediaries present, and beneficiaries seem to have gained knowledge of cohesion policy through these networks. So I confirm that hypothesis thanks to my research. In terms of the perception of the utility, we can see that the financial incentive was really the main motivation to engage with cohesion policy, while as European objectives are considered as not so important, or for some even not important at all. So there's clearly also a perceived reduction of the whole utility of cohesion policy. In terms of capacity, the most common difficulties emerging from my survey were administrative delays that many beneficiaries encountered, the production of documents, or just a simply understanding of what's requested of them. And quite some number of participants had or beneficiaries had a payment request, some invoices that were rejected. Now, this is still analysis in progress, but there seems to be a correlation with the levels of ambiguities, the three groups which I've identified earlier, who seem to face more of these difficulties and more of the utility, reduced utility as well, the slide I presented just earlier. So this is really, in a nutshell, what I wanted to present. In terms of conclusion, I hope that this analysis or analyzing complexity through the lens of policy ambiguity, I hope it provides a structure to a subject where really the number of variables is huge, be that in terms of the variable impacting beneficiary behavior, be that the number of variables on the implementation side, or also on the policy making side, and I hope that by looking at the whole thing through ambiguity, there is some structure which allows new insights on really the root causes of complexity, which I believe is complementing the literature on administrative capacity. And really, I guess understanding is the first step to many things, but well, I guess in this case, policy recommendations. So here are just some thoughts that I had on what could be improved at EU level. And I think that policy narratives could be strengthened. I think that would really be helpful in terms of clarifying what the policy is all about and what the different requirements are for. The interpretation of rules, I think, is a major issue that should be clarified in a way that a coherent application is possible. There could be more reliance on established domestic arrangement through enabling conditions or other means. And really the verifications and audits should be done the same way as domestic projects in order to reduce the discrepancy between how domestic projects funded through regional and national programs are implemented and how EU projects are implemented. I also have some recommendations at the domestic levels, but if you don't mind, I keep them for, they're not finalized yet, so I would like to discuss them first internally, and there's still work in progress, but maybe at another EPRC webinar, there could be an occasion to present those and go into further detail. So I think I'd stop here. I wanted to thank you for your attention, and I've put "see you soon" on the slide because I'm indeed genuinely interested in continuing the discussions on this topic, so feel free to contact me. And I also wanted to mention that I'm organizing a workshop during the European Week of Regions and Cities, which is in the beginning of October, so on the 8th of October. If you are still, if you are around in Brussels, do not hesitate to stop by at our event at the regional representation of the Auvergne Rhône-Alpes region in Brussels. I'm looking forward to your questions, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fabian. Very interesting presentation and very insightful on the topic of complexity, ambiguity, the relationships and the drivers. Just before we open for questions, see we've already got at least one hand up. I'll just quickly ask one. On your concept of ambiguity, would you be able to clarify how you measured that? I know you did, you had questionnaires, a survey, interviews, but what were the specific questions you asked to tap into to measure ambiguity? And I guess a second question of interest was, who were your beneficiaries? You've got a sample in, for instance, the survey. Were they mainly public? Were they private sector actors, businesses, other third sector organizations and stakeholders? Who was your target group? Thanks, Fabian. I see after John Bachler has his hand up.
Should I reply first, or
yeah,
or how do you? Or John, yeah.
Okay, good to see you, Fabian, and thanks for a presentation. There's a lot of scope for interesting research in this field, and good that you're tackling it. I suppose I've got a comment which follows on, relates to what Carlos was saying. I felt that maybe due to the lack of time, there was a sort of rather general usage of the term policy, and thus policy ambiguity, because it struck me that you're sort of talking about three interconnected but separate issues. One is objectives, one is rules, and one is processes. And The objectives comprise both sort of primary and secondary objectives. Daniel Tarshas famously wrote a paper on this years ago. And there's the question of, does the multiplicity and clarity of objectives matter? Secondly, you've got rules, which is how those objectives are translated into workable implementation. And here they need to respond at the way they're after at the moment to several sets of goals, which is absorption, regularity, performance are the principal ones. Getting the money spent quickly, making sure that it's spelled in line with the rules, particularly on financial management and in terms of effective performance. So the second aspect is the rules, and the third aspect are the processes by which managing authorities, intermediate bodies translate those into workable application and delivery processes. And I think I felt that at times you were conflating these three things, or these three aspects, and it might be helpful to sort of separate them out so it's clear, and particularly when you come to the policy recommendations, but also in terms of your theoretical model, what actually you're talking about and what matters. A second aspect, and this is, sort of responds to one of your final slides where you talked about the complexity of the area that you're working in, is that because you're interested in perceptions, it's critical that we're clear on whose perceptions. You've got actors at European level, at national level, you've got MAs, you've got intermediate bodies, you've got beneficiaries of different types, local authorities, companies, and so on. Wolf Huber, the former director of cohesion policy in Austria, famously wrote a really interesting paper on this, because those different actors, they each have a different interest. So at EU and national level, it may be important that there is a link between strategic planning documents and policy objectives. If you're a company, you just want the money. You're not interested in those issues, those higher level issues. And I think I didn't have a chance to look at your bar chart in turn, but I mean, you can see that the top one, need for the money, was, I think, seen as important by 75% of the beneficiary, whatever the figure was. Different actors will have different perceptions, and I think being clearly distinguishing between which actors have which perceptions, I think is really important, and whether those relate to the objectives, they relate to the rules, or they relate to the processes. Thanks.
Do you want me to maybe answer already before we take the
sorry,
next
yes,
question?
please do answer. I was muted.
Okay, no, that's great. Let me start then on the concept of ambiguity. So how did I measure it, or how did I look at it? Well, I guess ambiguity also is kind of a vague concept that can be measured essentially by observation. And as I mentioned, there's lots of variables, both at the beneficiary, also at the implementation level. I did group them into several categories, which have then translated into the questions. In terms of the implementation, I had the category of beliefs of the managing authorities, the employees of the managing authorities, The second was working conditions, everything that falls under working conditions. So my questions during the interviews were focusing really on different working conditions. And the third element was on interactions with other actors. And within these three categories, I was looking at situations of conflict, of situations of discrepancies in understanding of a given situation. And this is how I tried to, and also, of course, in the third of the interactions between actors, to really identify situations where the information, the implementation, and the interactions can be ambiguous. So really by observations. The second question was on who were the beneficiaries. I really tried to be exhaustive and send my questionnaire to all beneficiaries who have were in our database, who have benefited from ERDF or ESF support since 2014. So this is really reflects then obviously the thematic areas which we have. I did look at the statistics. It was approximately 60% public, 40% private. In terms of the answers I got, it's quite representative of really the whole set of beneficiaries we have. So the respondents kind of match our database of the beneficiaries, but it's really all kinds of actors who are eligible and who have managed to benefit from cohesion policy in the Auvergne Rhône-Alpes region. On John's comment, I think, yeah, it comes down to the lack of time and also the fact that this is ongoing process. Within my research, I have tried to separate objective rules and processes, which I agree I've maybe merged within in the presentation. It wasn't quite clear to separate them out, but I think, yeah, this is a point taken. So I think it could add to clarity in separating them out in some future presentations. On whose perceptions, I mean, yes, companies are in only for the money. That's true. However, I'm trying to make the argument that even if the underlying motivation to engage with cohesion policy or to apply for cohesion policy is the money that is behind it, if other objectives are clearly spelled out and understandable to a beneficiary, regardless of what type of beneficiary that is, then the complexity should be perceived as less. Because there's of course rules attached. Cohesion policy doesn't just give out the money as a charity. There are reporting requirements, justifications that need to be produced. And if the European public value of cohesion policy were recognized stronger at the beneficiary level, then I would argue the perception of complexity were also reduced. I hope that answers the questions, and I'm
Thank you, Fabian.
Happy for the next ones.
We do have two more. I believe the first would be Wolfgang Petzold and then Alison Hunter. Wolfgang.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for organizing the seminar to EPRC, and thank you, Fabian, for these insights. I would have a maybe provocative question to you. I think that future simplification, as much as I can see it from the viewpoint of mainly the Commission, would look like a silver bullet in which three letters are engraved, which is RRF. So my question would be, imagine your managing authority would get the money for performance and not any anyone needs to count for the payments anymore. The projects or the eligibility of costs need not to be checked anymore. But if, say, 2 indicators that could be regionalized for Auvergne Rhône-Alpes, which is, let's imagine, reduction of unemployment in the region and reduction of the level of disparity towards national or EU levels as regards the GDP. If those indicators were in place and the silver bullet would say you get 100% financing, whatever it takes, and we measure these indicators, let's say half-time in the process of the next MFF. Do you think that your colleagues would cry out for cheer and say, this is brilliant, we just do it? Because it would do away with a lot of, supposedly, with a lot of issues that are contributing to a not so simple management of the funds so far. Thank you.
Alison, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone, and hi Fabian. Nice to see you again. Thank you very much for sharing your presentation and your thinking on your PhD. It's really interesting and it's really complicated. I've got 3 points, but I'm going to focus on 2 of them. And a lot of it builds actually in what John was saying. The first thing for me is that in your presentation, the beginning of it, the title is really around simplification, but you focus much more on complexity than you do on simplification. And I think there's still something there around the relationship between complexity and simplification that's incredibly challenging to unpick, needless to say. But I'm not sure that came through strongly in the presentation. And again, maybe that was about the absence of time. The second point really relates to something that John was talking about, and I think some of the tensions here are about incentive incompatibility. And those are related both to the policy design and, of course, the implementation process. So we have in policy design this pursuit of simplification, and yet it does not lead to reduced complexity. So there's a complex relationship between those two. Also in policy design, the gold plating that you clearly mentioned also delivers a level of bureaucracy. And again, that there's an incompatibility within there. And then, of course, around implementation relating to, for example, financing, and then the impact of that financing. Beneficiaries looking for the financing, but clearly the policy side looking for what is the impact of that financing. So that's a difficult one to unpick, but I think it's perhaps at the root of some of the challenge. And then the third thing, which is possibly the most contentious and most challenging question, is can the identified challenges for the groups who are affected be overcome by different policy and process design? Or do we always end up with a synthetic fix in what we're seeking to do? And I think here, for example, you mentioned network effects. I don't think the network effects are just about increased knowledge and confidence. There is a kind of strength in numbers when people come back and complain about something, that they have a kind of network behind them there, and that can kind of open doors, which doesn't necessarily overcome the problem overall. Then also you mentioned common difficulties. And the biggest challenges that were noted there seem to be process related. So they were about delays, they were about documentation that's needed. That's a specific type of complexity, which needs different types of solutions. So I kind of go back to my bigger question there. Will the policy recommendations actually address the defined difficulties? Because there's so much wrapped up in that. So thank you very much for your time. Difficult questions, I think. Thank you.
Well, that's great. Thanks a lot for these questions and comments, because they really enrich my thinking and help me move forward in while getting everything on paper and then submitting this thesis in the not too distant future. So thanks a lot for this. On Wolfgang's comment, the RRF and the performance, I'm not sure in how far we or my colleagues at the managing authority would be happy. I mean, maybe it relates also to what Alison was saying afterwards, the incompatibility of incentives. And I think if we just provide the money based on performance indicators, I think the whole European dimension would be or could potentially be lost even further than it is currently the place in cohesion policy. That's one aspect I haven't mentioned so far, but I had the impression that also in cohesion policy, as it stands at the moment, the EU objectives, also at the implementation level, already are a kind of being lost due to the fact that they're trying to make it work for the beneficiaries. There are regional priorities, political priorities which need to be respected, and also there is clearly the objective to have an impact on the ground. And the EU dimension, the EU public value, is already, I get the impression, reduced during implementation of cohesion policy. Now, if I imagine that we have another model where only the performance matters, I think these European utility would be reduced even further, and the link towards the EU would be even less clear to a beneficiary. On Alison's comments, I think, well, the policy recommendations, would they change anything? I think in my research there is scope to refine the policy recommendations much further. So this is, I admit, I'm really just at the beginning of trying to define the policy recommendations and trying to understand really what implications my research potentially can have. I think in terms of the incentive capability, I think it would be even more important to strengthen the narrative, the policy narrative of cohesion policy, because on the one hand, that would clarify what the policy is all about, and the link here between the objectives and the rules and procedures, I think, is maybe becomes obvious, that if you know what a certain rule is for, if the rule is linked to an objective, then the perception of the complexity should be reduced. So I think that the policy recommendations should really focus on trying to be clear. I mean, that's the argument, reducing the ambiguity, and I think that should really comprise all the elements, be that the policy objectives, the rules, and the procedures, which in an ideal scenario should all be linked into a coherent thing, coherent policy implementation.
Okay, I think we've reached the end of the hour. Thank you, Fabian, for your presentation, and also to everybody for your insightful questions and answers. We look forward to seeing more of your work, the outputs, the publications, and further presentations. I think at the European Week of Regions and Cities, closest to us now. Just to let everybody know that our next webinar will be on the 23rd of October with Rebecca Bau from the EPRC Delft office, and that is looking at the use of language in co-creative participatory urban processes. So thanks again to Fabian and to everybody. We hope to see you again soon.
Thanks.